Atlas Public Policy is excited to launch our new podcast series, Buildings Hub Live, where we spotlight the changemakers and technologies leading the charge to electrify our built environment. This episode will be the first of many as we tackle the issues and complexities that building electrification faces, from space heating to water heaters to electric cooking. On today's inaugural episode, we'll be joined by Kathy Hannun, President and Founder of Dandelion Energy, and Alexis McKittrick, Program Manager with the Geothermal Technologies Office at the U.S. Department of Energy, to discuss the importance of geothermal heat pumps in decarbonizing the building stock in America. Thanks for joining us on this week's discussion of Buildings Hub Live. Here's your host, Atlas Policy Analyst, Zach Strauss.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Buildings Hub Live. My name is Zach Strauss, Policy Analyst at Atlas Public Policy, and I have the pleasure of being your host today. For our inaugural episode, we'll be diving deep to talk about a discussion near and dear to my heart, geothermal energy, and in particular, the role geothermal heat pumps are playing and continue to play in decarbonizing U.S. buildings. And you have to admit, using the Earth's energy to sustainably heat and cool your home while saving you money on energy bills, while slashing your emissions footprint, is pretty cool, not to mention a pretty great deal. For the uninitiated, geothermal heat pumps are electric HVAC appliances that use the near constant subsurface temperature of the Earth to heat buildings during the winter, while working in reverse to cool homes in the summer months. But before we jump into our discussion today, a quick note on Buildings Hub. At Atlas, we manage a one-stop shop data analysis tool for building sector electrification called Buildings Hub. If you're interested in current fuel prices, state policies and funding programs, the current makeup of the U.S. housing stock, we have you covered, and so much more. Check it out today. We'd love to have you join the Buildings Hub community. Now, for today's event, we're currently live on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And we encourage our audience today to send over your questions, and we'll pull them in as we go along. You can do so through the YouTube Q&A portal. We look forward to hearing from you throughout the session today. It is now my distinct honor to introduce our superstar geothermal speakers. We are joined today by none other than Kathy Hannun, President and Founder of Dandelion Energy, and Alexis McKittrick, Program Manager at the Geothermal Technologies Office with the U.S. Department of Energy. Welcome to the both of you, and thank you so much for being here to kick off Buildings Hub Live with us. We are so excited to have you with us today. Now, without further ado, we have a lot to cover. We only have about half an hour, so let's jump right in. So our first question, I'm going to push it over to Alexis. So it's so great to have you here. First, we'd love to have you introduce yourself. And first and foremost, can you explain to our audience on a high level what a geothermal heat pump is and how does it work?
Sure. Happy to, Zach. Thanks so much to you for having me on Building Hubs Live. Really excited to be here. So as Zach said, my name is Alexis McKittrick. I am a program manager within the U.S. Department of Energy's Geothermal Technologies Office. And I manage the low temperature and co-produced resources program within that office, which includes, among other technologies, geothermal heat pumps. So you actually gave a really great introduction to the basics of geothermal heat pumps, Zach. But they essentially use that constant temperature of the shallow earth that's going to be between 50 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit as thermal exchange in order to increase the efficiency and reduce energy consumption of heating and cooling, mainly for residential and commercial buildings. But we're seeing even more applications where these are being scaled up and used in network to create larger community scale systems, which I'm hoping we'll get into as we go through. Mm-hmm. Again, these systems have both a underground and above ground component. The underground component is what's going to actually do that thermal exchange with the subsurface and provide that heating in the winter and cooling in the summer. And it's a closed loop system of piping that can be tens of feet to even potentially hundreds of feet below the earth, depending upon where you are and what geology and geography you're located in. And then above ground, you're going to have, again, that traditional HVAC blower system that's connected to your geothermal heat pump. The heat pump is what's going to bring that energy transfer from the fluid to the incoming air that's either going to heat or cool your building. And so that's how it works. It's actually a decade-old technology. We are always, improving and perfecting it, in part due to some R&D done by the Geothermal Technologies Office, but it's a commercial technology that's available today.
Wow, thanks so much. A decade old. Yeah, I think people often assume this is sort of like a sci-fi, using earth power, magma power to heat and cool your house. But no, I guess it's been around for quite a while, and it's only increasing to advance. So you mentioned that the work you're doing at the GTO, the Geothermal Technologies Office. So can you explain at high level to our audience sort of what work y'all are up to? What are y'all doing to advance deployment and development for geothermal heat pumps at the federal level?
Sure, happy to. So I mentioned that I'm the program manager for the low temperature and co-produced resources. Essentially, when GTO says low temperature, we mean 300 degrees Fahrenheit or below, typically, or 150 C or below. And that includes geothermal heat pumps, as we've already discussed, but it also includes things like direct use systems, where you have a deeper geothermal well, maybe thousands of feet into the ground, that's directly using warm fluid, typically for heating in district systems like the one in Boise, Idaho, that's been around again for decades, one of the oldest systems in the US. And it also includes underground thermal energy storage technologies, as well as those scaled up or networked geothermal heat pump systems that are at the community scale. And particularly, we have a couple of initiatives that are focusing on how do we take, right, as we just said, these commercial technologies, and how do we deploy them at a higher level within the United States than we're seeing right now. And I'm really excited to announce that just today, the Geothermal Technologies Office has launched the Community Geothermal Heating and Cooling Design and Deployment Funding Opportunity Announcement. So this is a funding opportunity announcement, or FOA, that we've put out that will be up to $13 million in awards for communities to deploy community scale or district scale geothermal heating and cooling systems in their locale, in their location. We are looking for a diverse set of communities, urban, suburban, islanded communities, rural communities, to all apply for this. And we are looking for applications that include really powerful coalitions of folks. And by that, we mean we want to make sure that the community voices are represented in these coalitions. We want to make sure there's a strong analysis team. We want to make sure there's a workforce expert or expertise included to make sure that folks are thinking through how the local workforce can evolve as part of these systems, as well as have training and apprenticeship opportunities. And of course, you're going to need a partner that can actually deploy and install the system. And so that actually launched today. Applications are due October 11th. And we're really excited about the opportunity that will show for developing great case studies and exemplars throughout the US to show everyone how these community scale systems can be deployed and replicated throughout the United States.
Thank you so much. Exciting news that you're launching this new FOA, this bunch of money, right? This is a big deal. And we're going to talk a little bit more today about municipal applications for geothermal heat pump systems in our country, beyond just the ones we know about, like Boise, Idaho. And you mentioned geothermal installers, those key partners. So I decided to bring in Kathy. Kathy, you're the founder and president of Dandelion Energy, one of the leading geothermal installers, not just in the US Northeast, but in the country writ large. So can you give us a brief overview of Dandelion and why you decided to focus your career on this technology? Why did you set up shop in New York, and are you continuing to expand?
Absolutely. And thank you for having me. So I guess to start, I have focused my career for the last 7 or so years on geothermal heating and cooling because there's so much potential to offset so much energy use, so much emissions, and do so with a technology that lets people pay very little for heating and cooling. So here we have an example of a technology that not only is the most climate friendly way of heating and cooling buildings, it's also one of the least expensive to operate means of doing so. And I think it's relatively rare that those things line up. And we saw when I was first exploring the problem while I was a product manager at Google, I think what really struck me is that, as Alexis said, the technology is decades old, but very expensive upfront, which is why it hadn't really gotten a lot of traction in the market. And the more we dug into why it was so expensive, the more convinced I became it didn't have to be. And so Google, I co-founded it as a spin out. I co-founded Dandelion as a spin out of Google. And the mission of Dandelion was and continues to be to bring the cost down of geothermal and to make it widely available and just much more of a mainstream opportunity for people to use to heat and cool their homes. And we are primarily based in the Northeast today, but we do definitely aspire to expand beyond. We decided to start in New York and in the Northeast in general because there's millions of homes that are still using very expensive heating fuels like fuel oil and propane. And those homeowners are spending, $3,000-$4,000 a year just on heating fuels. And so they stand to save a lot of money by switching to geothermal. And the economics just make a lot of sense. So we're starting there, but as the cost comes down, we're expanding to neighboring states and then eventually, hopefully, to the country at large.
That's spectacular. Yeah, I'm excited to see you grow and expand to other first mover states, maybe places like Maryland, DC here in the DMV. Talked a lot about cost. We'll come back to that later, but I'd like to stick with Kathy and also Alexis. Feel free to jump in here. What advantages or benefits do ground source heat pumps have over other traditional HVAC systems? You talked a lot about maybe fuel or propane systems, gas-fired furnaces, radiative heating. And then an addendum to that, how do they might compare to air source heat pumps?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that some of the advantages against let's start with fuel oil or propane systems. Of course, one big advantage that customers like is you don't have to pay for fuel oil or propane. And that's been especially advantageous these days as the price of those fuels has skyrocketed. And also beyond the price, I think it's just kind of those fuels are a little bit inconvenient to use. I grew up in a home that used fuel oil in New Hampshire, and you just have to call to get the fuel delivered at the right times. And if you don't arrange the delivery or if it snows too much I don't know, like things can happen where you might not get the fuel delivered and then you're out of heat, which is hard. And then a lot of those homes don't necessarily have central air conditioning, which is increasingly a non-negotiable. Whereas with a heat pump, air source or ground source, the same system does heating and cooling. So you automatically get air conditioning. I think for natural gas, certainly gas is more convenient than fuel oil and propane, but you still have increasing prices. And I think a lot of homeowners are just aware that they don't want to be using a fossil fuel for heating forever. And so switching to a heat pump lets you get that air conditioning and heating all in one and move beyond a fossil fuel for heating. When it comes to comparing air source and ground source, I think both have a really important part to play in the transition. The benefits of air source are you don't need a ground loop, so it's simpler to install. And if you don't have a lot of space, like you don't have a yard, for example, then that's fine. You don't need one. I think the benefit of geothermal is the operating cost is lower because you have the higher efficiency, and they're able to heat very, very well, even when it's extremely cold, because you're thermally connected to the constant temperature underground. So I think it's really a case-by-case decision for a lot of people, what makes the most sense for them. But certainly both technologies will be really important as we switch to electrified heating.
Awesome. Great answer. Alexis, do you have anything to add?
I do. Again, +1 to all of those fantastic comments and thoughts. I think the only items I would add would just be to maybe put a little bit of a finer point on the reduction in fossil fuel use to just tout the important decarbonization benefits of transitioning to geothermal heat pumps and geothermal systems in general. If we're looking to meet our nation's climate change objectives and decarbonize our building stock, I think geothermal heat pumps in particular are just an incredibly important tool in that toolbox to reduce emissions overall. I also would say that that geothermal heat pumps do use a small amount, right, of electricity, but compared to other technologies that you might use, it is small, and it can be hybridized with other electrification technologies like solar, for example, to then create an entirely renewable system by hybridizing and coupling both solar and geothermal together. In addition to the notes earlier about how these are commercial technologies now, I would also add that they can work both in new construction and in retrofit situations, which I think it makes them incredibly versatile. And they can, as I mentioned in the context of the new funding opportunity, they can also create local craft and trade jobs as well, and an important clean energy workforce component.
I'd add one more thing, and I know we're spending some time on this, so let me know if we should move on. But we've been speaking a lot from or at least I should say, I've been speaking a lot from the homeowner's perspective. I think one important benefit of geothermal is that because of that ground connection, they lower summer peak demand. So they use less electricity when it's very hot outside. And just in general, they tend to have steadier, lower demand. So it's less peaky on the grid. So from a utility or grid perspective, there's a lot of benefit to geo, just in making it easier to electrify because you don't have to deal with so much peak usage. We did get a chat question, or a question from the audience, which was, there it is. Can you tell us more about advantage or disadvantage of geothermal versus, I think, air source in moderate climates like the Bay Area? I would say in general, when you have a climate where the ground temperature and the air temperature do not differ substantially, like some places in the Bay Area, there's less of an advantage. So in general, when you're thinking about the relative advantage of geo and air source, the more the air temperature departs from the ground temperature, the more your advantage for geo. So it's not to say that there isn't an advantage to geo. There still will be. It just, the magnitude will be smaller than a place that gets much colder or hotter.
Thanks so much for pulling that in. And you mentioned resilience benefits and lowering peak demand. I think it's a good opportunity. I'm from Texas, and we had not only a deep freeze, but we're now looking at 103-degree days. The Texas grid is trying to conserve energy. And there's a community in Texas called West River Valley that uses entirely geothermal heat pumps. And I will mention that in 2021, when we had our deep freeze, that community was one of the most resilient places in the state of Texas during that deep freeze because they relied on less energy consumption and were able to conserve and maintain heating throughout that period. So it is a good case study if anyone's interested to look at how this technology can really save lives, save money, and keep people safe.
Absolutely. And if I can add, Zach, also a great example of that hybridization that I was talking of earlier is I know that they're leveraging other renewable energy technologies and energy storage technologies at that location as well.
They are, and they all have a rooftop solar. So it's a whole ecosystem of clean energy technologies. So I'm going to jump to Alexis. You mentioned all these exciting things happening at the GTO, Department of Energy, but you also have a really ambitious goal to deploy 28 million residential geothermal heat pumps by the year 2050. However, the HUD New Construction Survey has estimated that only about 350,000 have been deployed in new homes since the turn of the century. What is your strategy for the country to meet that goal and to fill in the gap? What might be the best market development strategies from your opinion?
Absolutely. So yes, that 28 million geothermal heat pump deployments is a really exciting figure. And I want to emphasize that came from our 2019 GeoVision analysis. So again, if you Google DOE GeoVision, I believe it will be the first site that pops up for those who are interested. And essentially that number represents the market potential as we've analyzed for geothermal heat pumps nationwide. And so as we estimate that is the market potential, that is our goal, is to get there and to hopefully to get there, as you say, by 2050, which is really exciting, but as you said, very ambitious. There's a number of different initiatives that we have in place within the Department of Energy that will help us achieve this goal. One of them I already mentioned, which is our new funding opportunity that has come out today that's going to be really focused on community geothermal systems. I mention it again only to say that not only to encourage applications, but to say that those systems, we are hoping that those will develop, again, excellent test cases and exemplars in different geographies that then can show that these systems, again, can be utilized essentially anywhere in the country and help us reach that mass deployment. Because in many of those systems, not all, but in many of those systems that have different configurations, there are individual geothermal heat pumps at the individual residences or individual buildings, again, obviously sized appropriately for whatever load that you're looking for, that are essentially networked together. So they're part of that large deployment. The other initiative that I'd like to highlight is what's called our Federal Geothermal Partnership Initiative. So it's called FedGeo Partnerships for short. And this is a partnership with our sister office in Department of Energy, the Federal Energy Management Program, or FEMP. And so essentially, we are working together to look at and investigate and analyze data from different federal sites, so sites owned by the federal government, be they Department of Defense or GSA or Department of Energy or any other agency, and see what sites might be really great candidates either for geothermal heat pumps specifically or these larger district scale heating and cooling systems. And so that has kicked off with a lab award recently, a $6 million lab award to Oak Ridge National Laboratory, where they're going to be doing some site characterization work for different federal sites and hopefully showing that not only will these types of systems operate and work on federal sites, but to help the federal government really lead by example as we're looking to decarbonize our infrastructure and setting really ambitious decarbonization goals for the country.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I noticed that the DoD also put out an RFI, request for information on putting in geothermal heat pumps and geothermal systems at military bases, which is exciting. And the public sector also has they want to decarbonize their building stock. There's 300,000 public buildings in the country, right? They have to do it themselves. And so that's a great place to start too. So let's jump into one of our thornier topics, and that's going to be cost, especially cost for householders. So this is going to be for Kathy, who specializes in household geothermal technology deployment. How much might a typical system you sell cost? Say, for example, in an average home upstate New York, where are geothermal heat pumps most cost effective? And should we focus on specific programs and communities that are focused, for example, on, you said, fuel oil or low income communities?
Well, so we provide financing, and about half of our homeowners choose to finance the system, half choose to purchase upfront. So I'll talk about what that looks like in each case. But for homeowners who choose to finance, they'll pay nothing upfront and about $150 a month over a 20-year term. And that is a good deal for many people because that's less than they were paying on average for fuel oil or propane already. So nothing upfront and you're already cash flow positive. For homeowners who want to just buy the system, it's about $20,000-ish, though that's after incentives. So I should mention that is possible from incentives, and it varies widely across different markets, just given the nature of incentives and how they vary. But that's 20 to 25K is approximately where we're at. Was there more to your question?
Yeah, and are we looking at different programs for specific communities, whether they're environmental justice communities, low-income communities, or those communities specifically dependent on fuel oil?
Yeah, I mean, some of the states do have loan programs that specifically have sort of are targeted to lower income communities, or just have approval rates that are higher than you could find in the private market. And we do take advantage of that and try to make those options available to homeowners who need them. I think in terms of going after communities that use fuel oil, that happens automatically just because homeowners that are using fuel oil are going to be the most interested in finding an alternative to that really expensive fuel.
Mm-hmm.
And then from an environmental justice point of view, I do think that, whenever you're replacing a fossil fuel based system with a heat pump of any sort, that's air quality improvement for that home and for that neighborhood, and less risk of fuel oil spilling in the ground, and a lot of the environmental risks associated with using fossil fuels. I will say that we serve a pretty diverse range of markets, right? Like we have a lot of homeowners in rural upstate New York. We have a lot of homeowners in Westchester. So I do think that geothermal, we're seeing uptake across the demographic spectrum in many different types of communities, which is a good sign.
Yeah.
You mind if I jump in here?
Please go ahead. Absolutely.
I did want to mention specifically that the funding opportunity that dropped today, that I've already mentioned, is specifically looking at helping American communities reduce energy burden. So that's the percentage of gross household income spent on energy costs, as well as obviously fossil fuel dependence. And in particular, I know Kathy used a great example of like home heating oil, but especially those folks who not only have high energy burden, but also are struggling with the supply, right? Having a secure supply of heating and cooling for their homes and their communities. I think that's a space, as well as the emissions reduction locally, that this funding opportunity is really looking to serve. So again, just another note for those putting together coalitions, that's a particular goal of this funding opportunity.
Absolutely. Always trying to bring down costs to make this a technology for all, not a technology for the upper middle class single family homeowner. And that's, I think, moving in that direction. I think that's really excellent. This is for both of you, but we'll go ahead and, whoever wants to jump in, maybe Alexis can start us off. This is a question sort of looking at the broad. What are the major obstacles you see to wide scale geothermal heat pump deployment across the US, technical, political, or economic? And what do you see as potential solutions?
So it's a really good question, Zach. I think that, as you've heard from Kathy and I already, right? Again, these aren't new technologies. So in some ways, it is very frustrating that we haven't seen them deployed more broadly. And so the question then becomes, as you said, what are those barriers to expanding deployment? So one of them that you've already tackled is definitely cost. I really appreciate Kathy's comments about how the unique financing mechanisms and in many ways unique business models that are popping up all over the country, especially as we're looking at not only individual residences, but some of these larger systems. Can municipalities, be part of these systems? Can communities own their own systems, right? And what kind of unique financing is possible to kind of lower that upfront cost and lower that barrier to entry, which is again an incredibly big one. I also would say, that one piece that geothermal often suffers from is that you can't really see it, right? So again, at least in my world, we work a lot with other renewable energy technologies, wind turbines, solar panels, even hydroelectric dams. Like they're all large, familiar structures, right, that provide tangible evidence of the use of renewable energy that you can kind of point to and understand as you call these images to your brain. And geothermal doesn't really have that, right? It's when we're harnessing the heat beneath our feet, it literally is beneath our feet where we can't see it, or in the infrastructure that is inside of the homes. And so we're hoping, as part of like a larger public, awareness and stakeholder outreach campaign, and through really, really great opportunities like this one, to really get the word out on geothermal heat pumps and geothermal technology, because spreading awareness is hopefully going to lead to increased acceptance and use.
Yeah, it's definitely an awareness gap. You're definitely right. My parents just bought a new home and they hadn't even thought about this as an option. And they live in a place where it's really hot all the time. So it could have been applicable. I think I'd leave to drop the question from the audience to Kathy, because you work with a lot of utility programs. How are utilities engaging? Now, you work a lot in New York. You have the joint utilities investing a lot of money in heat pump deployments. How are these utility incentives and programs really impacting your market?
Yeah, the utilities are very engaged in our markets in New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Jersey and Vermont. And they are engaged by providing incentives. So they help defray some of the upfront costs for homeowners to make it more affordable. And it really is effective. It caused a lot more homeowners to switch. So that's been very meaningful for us. I wanted to add one thought to the question you posed about the barriers. I think from my perspective, one of the biggest barriers is workforce. I mean, when I think about the scale that Alexis is talking about, I think it was 29 million geothermal systems by 2050. That's roughly 1 million a year. And just asking the question, like, how many drills and drillers? So, drills, but then skilled people who can use them to put in geothermal wells, right? Like how many would that take? And then comparing that to what we have today, right? Like one of Dandelion's big challenges that we're making a lot of progress against, but it hasn't been easy even at our scale, is finding that workforce, training those drillers, and just there isn't a large pool of geothermal installers today in the United States. So I think that is a challenge that we will have to, infrastructure. It always comes down to infrastructure. And it's something that we'll have to overcome to meet that goal.
Yeah, it looks like a equity and training program from the federal government might be important. Some sort of, apprenticeship program could be useful. We're running out of time, but I did want to touch really quickly on something that Alexis mentioned, was the municipal scale applications. So how would geothermal heat pumps apply to these thermal energy networks? We saw the New York State just passed a law authorizing their implementation. What does that look like? We talked about Boise. It's been around about 100 years. What does that look like beyond Idaho? Alexis, that's for you.
Oh, it's for me. I apologize. I apologize. So what's really great about what we're seeing in the thermal energy network space right now, and including legislation like what we've seen in New York State, is that these community scale systems, which is how I've been referring to them, they look a little different everywhere, right? So Kathy talked earlier about when we were talking about air source versus ground source, how it kind of depends upon where you are, and it depends upon a number of different parameters in your location. We are finding that from campuses to communities, to even private sector, like tech campuses and such, folks are taking these thermal energy network systems, right? And they're adapting them to fit their own needs, right? So whether that means having, 1,000 boreholes, under a campus parking lot in order to do the right amount of heat exchange with the subsurface for a campus scale system, or if that means, potentially a mile of piping, built into a concrete structure as a heat sink, there's a lot of different ways to make these kind of district scale energy systems work. And we're seeing, obviously, that geothermal energy in particular is a large part of these. But I actually really like that New York State has kind of coined this as a thermal energy network, because it makes it nice and broad, and it allows that flexibility for whatever, if you're in an urban environment, if you're in a suburban, if you're in a rural environment, to make that system whatever your community and your location needs. I think we're going to see it grow because we're seeing so many different variations, and because it's hard to put a pin on exactly what these systems look like now, because there's so many different ways that they function.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and if you're interested in examples for our audience out there, it's West Virginia University, as well as Cornell University. You have Ball State University in Indiana. They're doing, either they established them already or they're building them. You have, military bases trying to put them in. So they're applicable everywhere, and they're growing. I saw Eversource in Massachusetts is trying to retrofit an entire neighborhood to do it. So that's exciting. So utilities are also engaging. But I'll put a pin in that. We're running out of time. I want to go through our lightning round with our speakers today. And that essentially entails that in 20 seconds or less, what is your vision for the geothermal heat pump industry? What do you anticipate it looking like in 5-10 years? And I'll start with Kathy.
All right. So my vision is that it will become much simpler to install geothermal. We'll do it at much greater scale. There will be broad recognition of the technology. Everyone will know somebody who has geothermal. And there will be much more competition in the market. There will be a much larger workforce of people who have been trained at one company that go on to start their own companies or go to other companies. And I think that we'll just get to a point where when somebody's furnace breaks, they will feel like of course they're going to replace it with a heat pump, right? I think we'll get to a place where people will just not want, either because policy won't let them or just because they'll see the writing on the wall. It just won't make sense to get another fossil fueled heater. And lastly, I think that new build is going to lead the way on that. And as we are constructing all these new homes in the country, I think within 5 years, we'll see a lot of them switch to heat pumps, just because I think builders will realize we aren't going to be putting new furnaces, fossil fueled furnaces in buildings that will then go on to last 15 or 20 years.
Yeah. Don't want to put in a stranded asset, essentially. All right. Thanks so much. Appreciate that. Over to Alexis in 20 seconds or less.
Right. So I think you'll have heard we're really excited about the range of possibilities for this low temperature technology and geothermal heat pumps and these community scale systems. So the vision for us is to show that they can work everywhere, and look to use things like our new funding opportunity to really catapult deployment to all corners and even islands of the United States, and hopefully see, as Kathy said, as a result, that really broad adoption, that increased awareness, so that this is what's first on everyone's mind for technology. And that's a really exciting future that hopefully would also have really great impacts on energy equity in our society as well.
Thank you so much for that insightful answer. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. I want to say thank you so much to both our speakers for joining us and to providing their expertise and their insight. To everyone in the live audience who participated and shared your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but thank you so much for being so engaged this afternoon. Should you wish to watch this episode of Buildings Hub Live again or share it with friends or colleagues, you can find it on our Atlas YouTube page, as well as on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. We encourage you to check out Buildings Hub and to join our electrification community. You can find us at atlaspublicpolicy.com. Thank you again. We'll catch you on the next episode of Buildings Hub Live. We hope to see you soon.